The radar screen flickered with 11 hostile contacts, JF-17 Thunder fighters spreading across the northern corridor like wolves sensing wounded prey. Flight Lieutenant Zara Phoenix Nakamura watched the crimson dots converge on her position, each pulse of the radar sweep tightening the noose around her damaged F-16 Fighting Falcon. Her left engine was bleeding fuel, hydraulics were compromised, and she was 300 nautical miles from friendly airspace with no backup plan. The radio crackled with Pakistani Air Force chatter, their voices sharp with excitement. They thought they had cornered a rookie pilot making a desperate run for the border. What they didn't know was that the woman in their crosshairs had spent the last 15 years perfecting the art of impossible escapes. Phoenix adjusted her grip on the stick, feeling the aircraft's wounded response to her touch. The F-16 shuddered like an old friend bearing pain in silence. Squadron leader Tariq Hassan led the intercepting formation, his JF-17's canopy reflecting the harsh afternoon sun over the disputed Kashmiri peaks. Through his HUD, he tracked the lone American fighter weaving between mountain valleys at dangerously low altitude. The pilot was skilled, he'd give them that, but skill alone wouldn't bridge the gap between one damaged aircraft and 11 fresh hunters. Viper lead, this is control. We have you painted by multiple threats. Recommend immediate RTB via alternate route Whiskey 7. The voice of her controller at Bagram crackled through static. Phoenix keyed her mic with practiced calm. Control, Phoenix. Negative on Whiskey 7. That route's compromised. I'm going with Option Charlie. There was a pause. Option Charlie didn't exist in any manual. Hassan's wingman, Captain Mehdi Raza, pulled alongside his leader's aircraft. Sir, the American is descending into the Skardu Valley. She's boxing herself in. Hassan studied his tactical display, watching the enemy fighter drop below the radar horizon. Something felt wrong. The maneuver was either desperate stupidity or calculated brilliance, and desperate pilots didn't fly with such precise heading changes. He'd studied American tactics for a decade, memorized their playbooks, knew their standard evasion patterns. This wasn't standard anything. The valley below stretched like a granite canyon, its walls climbing thousands of feet into snow-capped peaks. Ancient glacial cuts created a maze of tributaries and dead ends, perfect terrain for hiding a fighter or creating the world's most expensive grave. Hassan banked left, leading his formation in a wide arc to cover the valley exits. If the American pilot thought she could play hide-and-seek in the mountains, she was about to learn why the JF-17 was built for this terrain. Phoenix checked her fuel gauge and smiled grimly. Sometimes the impossible was just another word for untested. The first lesson they taught at the Navy's Top Gun school was that aerial combat wasn't about the aircraft. It was about the pilot. Phoenix had learned that lesson the hard way over the skis of Afghanistan, where she'd earned her call sign by flying missions that should have been suicide runs and returning home with nothing but fumes in her tanks and prayers answered. The instructors at Miramar had initially doubted whether a Japanese-American woman from San Francisco's Richmond district belonged in the cockpit of a multi-million-dollar fighter jet. They stopped doubting after she outflew their best male pilots in simulated combat exercises. Hassan's formation spread into a search pattern, their JF-17s cutting through mountain air with predatory grace. The Chinese-Pakistani joint venture had produced an aircraft perfectly suited for high-altitude operations, and Hassan knew these mountains like the lines on his weathered hands. He'd grown up in Skardu, watching his father guide climbers toward K2's deadly summit. The same instincts that kept mountaineers alive applied to aerial hunting: patience, preparation, and respect for the terrain that could kill you faster than any enemy. Shaheen Flight, this is lead. Maintain search pattern Alpha. Target cannot have vanished. Hassan's voice carried the confidence of a man who'd never lost prey in these valleys. His radar showed empty sky where the American fighter should be, but aircraft didn't simply disappear. They crashed or they hid, and he'd find which one soon enough. 3,000 feet below, Phoenix skimmed the valley floor at treetop level, her damaged F-16 following the serpentine path of an ancient riverbed. Her HUD painted warnings in amber and red: altitude critical, terrain warning, engine fire warning. She disabled the most insistent alarms to focus on flying. The Pratt & Whitney engine's temperature gauge climbed steadily toward the red line, but she needed every pound of thrust to maintain this insane flight profile. The river twisted between granite walls, carved by millions of years of snowmelt into a natural highway barely wide enough for fighter wings. Phoenix had studied satellite imagery of this region during mission planning, memorizing every bend and outcropping. What she hadn't told her mission commander was that she'd also studied something else: classified reports of a Soviet pilot who'd used similar terrain to evade American fighters during the Cold War. The CIA had called his escape route the ghost flight pattern, because radar operators swore aircraft vanished into thin air before reappearing miles away. Control, Phoenix, going silent for tactical movement. She switched off her transponder and activated electronic countermeasures. To Hassan's hunting pack, she would now be invisible unless they achieved visual contact. Hassan noticed the radar contact's disappearance immediately. His tactical officer confirmed what he already knew: the American had gone dark. Standard evasion protocol, but executed at exactly the wrong moment if she hoped to escape. By going silent in the valley, she trapped herself in a geographic cage with only two exits, both of which his formation now controlled. Captain Raza's voice cut through radio chatter. "Sir, historical analysis suggests Soviet pilots used this valley during the '80s war, called it the Moscow Express." Hassan considered this intelligence while banking his JF-17 toward the valley's eastern exit. History had a way of repeating itself, especially in Afghanistan, where ancient trade routes still dictated modern military movements. If the American pilot knew those old Soviet tactics, she might attempt something audacious. But audacity without support was just another word for suicide, and he had 11 aircraft to her damaged one. Phoenix felt the F-16 shudder as she pulled 4GS through a knife-edge turn between canyon walls. The aircraft's fly-by-wire system fought to maintain stable flight, while she pushed physics to its breaking point. Her pressure suit squeezed her legs and torso, forcing blood back toward her brain as G-forces tried to drain consciousness away. Through gritted teeth, she whispered the pilot's prayer her instructor had taught her 15 years ago: "Grant me the serenity to accept the physics I cannot change, courage to change the flight path I can, and wisdom to know the difference." The valley floor rushed past in a blur of stones and sparse vegetation, the altimeter reading numbers that would make safety officers weep. But Phoenix wasn't flying for safety. She was flying for survival, and survival demanded risks that no regulation manual would ever approve. Her thumb hovered over the emergency jettison for her external fuel tanks. The extra weight was slowing her down, but the fuel might be the difference between reaching friendly airspace and becoming a smoking crater in Pakistani territory. Hassan's formation had settled into overwatch positions, covering both valley exits when his radar operator detected something unusual. Faint returns were bouncing off the granite walls, too weak and intermittent to be aircraft, but too regular to be weather phenomena. He'd seen similar signatures before during training exercises in the Himalayas. They called it mountain ghosts, radar reflections from aircraft flying so low that electromagnetic energy scattered off rock faces instead of returning clean pings. All flights, this is lead. Target is using terrain masking at extreme low altitude. Recommend visual search pattern. She's still in the valley. The acknowledgments came back crisp and professional. Hassan's pilots were among Pakistan's finest, trained at the same schools where he'd learned to hunt in 3 dimensions. But as he watched the sun angle lower toward the western peaks, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years of flying these mountains: uncertainty. The American pilot was operating outside tactical doctrine, improvising solutions that no flight manual covered. Improvisation was dangerous because it made the enemy unpredictable. Phoenix checked her navigation display against the valley's terrain features. 2 kilometers ahead, the riverbed split into a Y-junction where an ancient tributary carved its own path toward the high peaks. The left branch led to a dead end beneath a hanging glacier. The right branch continued toward the border, but Hassan's formation certainly had that route covered. Neither option offered much hope, but Phoenix had stopped believing in conventional hope years ago. The radio crackled with Pakistani transmissions as Hassan's pilots coordinated their search. Phoenix smiled despite her situation. They were being thorough, professional, exactly as their training demanded. But thoroughness took time, and time was the one resource she might be able to steal in sufficient quantity to matter. She armed her chaff and flare dispensers, though electronic countermeasures would be useless at this altitude against visual hunting. The real countermeasure was audacity combined with precise flying. Phoenix had both in abundance, plus something her adversaries couldn't account for, the desperate creativity of a pilot who'd already survived impossible situations and had no intention of breaking that streak in Kashmir's granite valleys. Hassan's wingman spotted the first clue 15 minutes into the search pattern. A faint contrail dissipated against the northern valley wall, too low to be commercial traffic and too recent to be anything but their quarry. He radioed the position immediately, banking his JF-17 toward the sighting while his flight computer calculated intercept vectors. Lead, Shaheen 2. I have contrail evidence bearing 020, altitude approximately 8,000 feet. Target appears to be following riverbed toward Junction Alpha. Hassan acknowledged and adjusted his formation search pattern. The American pilot was good, but physics couldn't be defeated by skill alone. Flying that low in a damaged aircraft was borrowed time with compounding interest. Every minute she stayed in the valley increased the odds of controlled flight into terrain, and Hassan's job was simply to maintain pressure until gravity and fuel starvation finished what his missiles had started. Phoenix felt the F-16's port engine lose another 100 degrees of temperature margin as she pulled through the valley junction. The tributary route beckoned to her left, a narrow canyon that climbed toward glacial ice fields where no fighter aircraft had any business flying. Her fuel state was approaching emergency reserves. Hydraulic pressure was dropping toward minimum flight requirements, and her ejection seat's survival gear wouldn't keep her alive for more than a few hours in this terrain, even if she could survive the bailout sequence. But the tributary canyon offered something no tactical manual had ever quantified. It led to airspace so dangerous that even desperate pilots avoided it. Phoenix had studied the topographical surveys during mission planning, noting the terrain features that made this route impassable for conventional aircraft. What made it impassable also made it invisible to enemy expectations. She keyed her radio one final time before committing to the impossible. Control, Phoenix. If you don't hear from me in 30 minutes, tell my sister I flew like she taught me. The transmission was brief, cryptic, and utterly professional. Hassan's communication intercept equipment captured every word, but the meaning remained opaque. American pilots were trained to maintain operational security even in extremis, revealing nothing useful to hostile listeners. Still, something in the pilot's tone suggested finality rather than desperation. Phoenix banked left into the tributary canyon, her damaged F-16 disappearing from visual contact as granite walls rose around her like the entrance to another world. Hassan studied his tactical display with growing frustration. The American fighter had vanished again, this time into terrain that his own tactical database labeled as impassable for military aircraft. The tributary canyon climbed at angles that would challenge helicopter flight, much less a wounded F-16 operating on emergency power. Either the enemy pilot had just committed elaborate suicide, or she knew something about mountain flying that his extensive training hadn't covered. He ordered his formation to maintain overwatch while he analyzed the situation. Standard pursuit doctrine called for following the target into terrain, but Hassan had lost too many good pilots to mountain flying accidents. The Himalayas killed more aviators than enemy action, and chasing a desperate pilot into impossible terrain was exactly how squadrons lost multiple aircraft to single targets. Captain Raza's voice cut through Hassan's tactical analysis. "Sir, that tributary leads to the Siachen approach route. No aircraft has successfully navigated that corridor since the Soviet withdrawal." Hassan felt his blood chill. The Siachen approach was legendary among Pakistani and Indian pilots, a glacial corridor that climbed through peaks exceeding 25,000 feet, where wind shears and downdrafts had destroyed aircraft attempting passage. The route was theoretically possible for specially equipped aircraft under perfect conditions, but no pilot had ever been desperate enough to attempt it in a damaged fighter while being pursued by enemy forces. Phoenix felt the F-16 strain against thinning air as the canyon climbed toward the high peaks. Her oxygen system was functioning normally, but the aircraft's engine performance degraded with every 1,000 feet of altitude gain. The tributary's granite walls pressed closer together, forcing her to maintain precise flight paths with diminishing margin for error. One miscalculation would spread her F-16 across ancient stone in a fireball visible from orbit. The canyon's geometry created its own weather system. Air currents ricocheted off granite faces in unpredictable patterns, creating turbulence that hammered her aircraft like invisible fists. Phoenix fought the controls constantly, feeling the F-16's damaged systems protest every demand she placed on flight surfaces and engine thrust. Sweat beaded inside her helmet despite the frigid outside air temperature. Her navigation system showed the canyon's terminus approaching, a hanging valley where glacial ice filled the space between towering peaks. Beyond that ice field lay the most dangerous flying in the world, the Siachen Corridor, where Pakistani and Indian forces had fought the world's highest altitude war for decades. If she could traverse the corridor, friendly airspace beckoned on the far side. If she couldn't, her remains would join dozens of other aviators who'd underestimated the mountain's killing power. Hassan made his decision based on 20 years of mountain flying experience. The American pilot had chosen suicide over capture, attempting a route that would destroy her aircraft more efficiently than his missiles. He ordered his formation to withdraw to defensive positions, covering the corridor's theoretical exit point. If by some miracle the enemy fighter survived passage through the Siachen approach, his JF-17s would be waiting to finish the engagement in civilized airspace. All flights, this is lead. Maintain CAP at grid reference November 7. Target has entered impassable terrain. We wait for her exit or confirmation of impact. The acknowledgments came back immediately. Hassan's pilots trusted his judgment, but he could hear uncertainty in their voices. They were trained hunters, and hunters preferred to witness their prey's final moments rather than assume natural forces had completed the kill. But pursuing the American into the Siachen corridor would risk losing multiple aircraft to achieve what gravity would accomplish for free. Phoenix reached the hanging valley as her fuel gauge touched reserve levels. The ice field stretched ahead like a frozen ocean, its surface marked by crevasses that could swallow her F-16 without trace. Altitude readings showed 22,000 feet and climbing, approaching the service ceiling for her damaged aircraft. Engine performance was deteriorating rapidly in the thin air, forcing her to accept reduced power settings that barely maintained level flight. She activated her oxygen flow to maximum and checked her pressure suit's heating elements. The cockpit temperature was dropping toward freezing despite environmental systems operating at full capacity. Outside, the landscape looked like another planet, pure white ice extending toward peaks that disappeared into cloud layers. No human activity marked this wilderness, no roads or structures to indicate that civilization had ever touched this place. The Siachen corridor opened before her like a gap between sleeping giants. Peaks rose on both sides to altitudes exceeding 28,000 feet, creating a natural wind tunnel where air currents accelerated to velocities that could flip aircraft like leaves in a hurricane. Phoenix had studied meteorological data for this region, memorizing wind patterns and thermal dynamics that made flight possible only during specific atmospheric conditions. Today's conditions were marginal at best, but marginal was better than the certain death that Hassan's formation represented. She advanced throttles to military power, feeling the wounded F-16 surge forward into the corridor's mouth as physics and determination collided in the thin mountain air. The first wind shear nearly inverted her aircraft before Phoenix could compensate with opposite controls. The F-16 bucked like an angry horse, its fly-by-wire system struggling to maintain stable flight, as conflicting air masses created invisible turbulence strong enough to tear wings from fuselages. Warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel: engine overtemperature, hydraulic pressure critical, electrical system fluctuations. Phoenix ignored the warnings and focused on flying. The corridor's walls rose vertically on both sides, their granite faces worn smooth by millions of years of wind and ice. Glacial streams cascaded down the rock in frozen waterfalls that caught sunlight like scattered diamonds. Beautiful and deadly, the mountains demanded perfect flying with no tolerance for human error. Her radio captured fragments of Hassan's transmissions as his formation maintained distant overwatch. They were disciplined enough to resist pursuit into impossible terrain, but professional enough to maintain surveillance in case she somehow survived the corridor passage. Phoenix respected their tactical patience even as she plotted to make their caution irrelevant. The F-16's engine struggled against increasingly thin air as the corridor climbed toward its highest point. Phoenix felt the aircraft's performance envelope shrinking with every 1,000 feet of altitude gain. Her airspeed was bleeding away despite maximum throttle settings, forcing her to accept flight attitudes that balanced lift requirements against stall margins with mathematical precision. At 26,000 feet, the corridor reached its narrowest point, a gap between peaks barely wide enough for fighter wings in level flight. Phoenix approached the choke point with her aircraft trimmed for minimum possible airspeed, knowing that turbulence in the gap could exceed her control authority if she carried too much energy into the passage. The wind hit her F-16 like a physical blow, rolling the aircraft 90 degrees right before she could counter with opposite aileron. Granite walls flashed past her canopy close enough to count individual stones, the clearance measured in feet rather than the comfortable hundreds that separated normal flying from certain death. Phoenix pulled the aircraft back to wings-level flight through pure muscular effort, feeling G-forces that made her pressure suit inflate to prevent blood pooling. She was through the gap and descending toward the corridor's exit when her port engine finally surrendered to physics. Warning lights painted her cockpit red as the Pratt & Whitney wound down to silence, its internal components too damaged to maintain combustion in the thin air. The F-16 immediately became a single-engine aircraft operating at altitudes where single engines weren't sufficient for sustained flight. Phoenix felt the aircraft settle into a controlled descent as remaining engine power balanced against gravity in an equation that strongly favored the mountains. Her fuel state showed minutes rather than hours of flight time remaining, and her navigation display indicated another 50 kilometers to friendly airspace. Mathematics suggested she wouldn't make it, but Phoenix had stopped trusting mathematics years ago when it came to survival. She activated emergency power settings on her remaining engine, accepting increased fuel consumption in exchange for temporary thrust recovery. The engine responded with a surge of power that arrested her descent temporarily, buying time to establish a gliding descent toward lower altitudes where the air was thick enough to sustain flight on reduced power. Hassan's radar operator detected the first signs of success 15 minutes after the American fighter disappeared into the corridor. Faint electromagnetic returns suggested an aircraft approaching the gap's exit point, though the signals were too weak to confirm identity or flight status. Hassan ordered his formation to converge on the exit coordinates, preparing for engagement if the impossible had somehow occurred. Shaheen Flight, this is lead. Target may have survived corridor passage. Recommend attack formation Delta. Weapons free upon positive identification. His pilots acknowledged with professional precision, their JF-17s accelerating toward the corridor exit while weapon systems cycled to combat-ready status. Hassan felt grudging admiration for the American pilot's skills, even as he prepared to destroy her aircraft in the final engagement. Surviving the Siachen corridor in a damaged fighter represented flying ability that transcended normal human limitations. Phoenix emerged from the corridor's mouth with her F-16 trailing vapor from its remaining engine. Altitude showed 18,000 feet and descending, airspeed barely above stall limits, fuel gauge reading empty with fumes keeping her aloft through mechanical sympathy alone. She'd accomplished the impossible by threading her aircraft through terrain that no tactical manual considered navigable, but survival required reaching friendly forces before fuel starvation ended her flight permanently. Her radar threat display immediately painted hostile contacts approaching from multiple bearings. Hassan's formation had positioned themselves perfectly to intercept her exit from the corridor, their patience rewarded with a tactical advantage that made escape impossible through conventional means. Phoenix was out of altitude, out of fuel, and out of reasonable options for survival. But unreasonable options remained on the table, and Phoenix had built her entire military career on accomplishing unreasonable things through superior flying and creative tactical thinking. She armed her remaining weapons and turned toward the approaching JF-17s, accepting battle rather than attempting futile evasion. If this was where her story ended, she would write the final chapter on her own terms. Hassan watched his tactical display update as the American fighter turned toward his formation instead of attempting escape. The maneuver violated every principle of aerial combat doctrine. Damaged aircraft should never initiate engagement against superior numbers. Either the enemy pilot had finally succumbed to desperation, or she had one final trick that his experience couldn't predict. Captain Raza's voice carried surprise as he reported visual contact. "Sir, American fighter is closing for engagement. Single-engine operation confirmed. Aircraft appears heavily damaged but maintains controlled flight." Hassan studied the geometry developing on his display. The American pilot was flying directly toward his formation center, accepting missile engagement rather than trying to extend the engagement range. The tactic was either suicidal courage or calculated brilliance, and Hassan's 20 years of mountain flying had taught him never to underestimate pilots desperate enough to survive impossible terrain. Phoenix felt the F-16 respond to her final control inputs as she closed distance with Hassan's formation. Her HUD painted targeting solutions on the lead JF-17, while her weapons systems achieved lock-on parameters. The Pakistani fighters were flying perfect tactical formation, their positioning designed to maximize firepower while minimizing mutual interference. Standard doctrine that worked brilliantly against standard opponents. But Phoenix had never been standard in any measurable way. Her thumb found the weapon release button as targeting computers calculated firing solutions that defied probability mathematics. Sometimes the impossible was just another word for untested, and today she intended to test theories that no flight school had ever taught. The first missile left her aircraft as Hassan's formation detected weapon launch and began defensive maneuvering. Phoenix watched the AIM-120 AMRAAM streak toward the lead JF-17, while her remaining engine finally surrendered to fuel starvation. The F-16 immediately became a glider with combat capabilities, trading potential energy for time while physics prepared to collect its final payment. Hassan felt his aircraft shudder as proximity warnings screamed through his headset. The American missile was tracking perfectly despite being launched from a disadvantageous position, its guidance system maintaining lock despite his defensive maneuvers. He deployed chaff and flares while pulling maximum G-forces, feeling his JF-17 strain against structural limits as he attempted to defeat the incoming weapon. The missile detonated 50 meters from his starboard wing, close enough for fragmentation to pepper his aircraft's fuselage without achieving direct impact. Hassan felt control surfaces stiffen as hydraulic lines severed and electrical systems fluctuated under blast effects. His JF-17 remained flyable but degraded, no longer the perfect hunter it had been moments before. Phoenix watched the results of her missile shot while establishing best glide attitude in her powerless F-16. Hassan's aircraft was damaged but airworthy, still capable of completing the engagement if she couldn't maintain tactical pressure. Her remaining weapons included one Sidewinder missile and her internal cannon, neither sufficient to defeat multiple opponents under normal circumstances. But circumstances had stopped being normal the moment she'd entered the tributary canyon, and Phoenix had built her reputation on making abnormal circumstances work in her favor. She rolled inverted and pulled toward the valley floor, using gravity to maintain airspeed while her unpowered aircraft became the world's most expensive glider. Hassan's wingman achieved missile lock and fired, the Chinese-built SD-10 streaking toward the descending American fighter with terminal guidance active. Phoenix detected the launch immediately and deployed her remaining countermeasures, but chaff and flares were poor protection against a missile fired from optimal range by an undamaged aircraft. She waited until the last possible moment before pulling maximum G-forces, feeling consciousness gray at the edges as her aircraft climbed vertically in a last-ditch defensive maneuver. The missile flashed past her canopy close enough to read Chinese characters on its warhead, its proximity fuse failing to detonate due to the extreme geometry of her defensive turn. Phoenix rolled back toward the valley floor as her vision cleared, watching her altimeter unwind toward terrain proximity warnings. She had perhaps 90 seconds of controlled flight remaining before her F-16 would require landing, voluntarily or otherwise. The mathematical certainty of her situation was oddly liberating. With no hope of conventional escape, she was free to attempt tactics that would have been suicide with other options available. Hassan regrouped his formation while assessing battle damage to his aircraft. His JF-17 was flying on backup hydraulics with reduced control authority, but remained combat-capable for the final engagement. The American pilot had demonstrated skills that bordered on supernatural, but skill couldn't overcome basic physics indefinitely. Her aircraft was dead stick in a glide toward terrain that offered no suitable landing sites. Captain Raza reported fuel state and weapons status as the formation prepared for the final attack. All aircraft retained sufficient ordnance to destroy the American fighter multiple times over, and their tactical position offered every advantage except one: the enemy pilot's apparent willingness to die fighting rather than accept inevitable defeat. Phoenix spotted the feature she'd been searching for as her F-16 descended through 8,000 feet. A frozen lake stretched between mountain peaks, its surface covered with ice thick enough to support heavy aircraft if approached with precisely the right technique. The lake wasn't marked on any aviation charts as a suitable landing site, but Phoenix had studied satellite imagery that suggested emergency landing possibilities for desperate pilots with sufficient skill. She aligned her aircraft with the lake's longest axis while configuring emergency landing systems. Landing gear remained retracted to minimize drag during the approach, forcing her to plan a belly landing on ice that might or might not support her aircraft's weight. The technique violated every regulation in the book, but the book hadn't been written for pilots gliding toward frozen lakes while being pursued by enemy fighters. Hassan watched his tactical display with growing puzzlement as the American fighter lined up with terrain features that offered no tactical advantage. The lake was a dead end surrounded by impassable peaks, perfect terrain for completing the engagement without risk of collateral damage. If the enemy pilot intended to crash-land her aircraft, she was making his job considerably easier. Phoenix felt the F-16 settle into final approach attitude as the frozen lake filled her windscreen. Ice stretched ahead like a runway designed by glacial forces instead of human engineers, its surface marked by pressure ridges that could destroy landing gear or fuselage if approached incorrectly. She had one chance to execute a perfect dead stick, landing on terrain that had never been tested for aircraft operations. Her altimeter showed 500 feet and descending as Hassan's formation positioned for the final attack. Multiple missile lock-on warnings screamed through her headset, but Phoenix ignored them while focusing on landing parameters. Speed, attitude, and touchdown point had to be perfect, or her aircraft would become scattered wreckage across the ice field. Hassan held fire as he watched the American fighter approach the lake in a controlled descent. Professional curiosity outweighed tactical necessity. He wanted to see if she could actually land her aircraft on the frozen surface. If she succeeded, he would have witnessed flying skill that transcended anything his training had prepared him to evaluate. Phoenix flared her F-16 at the last possible moment, bleeding airspeed while keeping the aircraft's nose above the horizon. The lake's surface rushed toward her at closing speeds that left no margin for error. Ice, metal, and human determination converged in a moment that would either end in successful landing or spectacular destruction. The F-16 touched down on the frozen lake with surprisingly gentle contact, its belly sliding across ice that proved thicker and more stable than Phoenix had dared hope. She felt the aircraft decelerate through friction alone, no reverse thrust or wheel brakes available to control the landing roll. Physics and luck would determine whether she stopped before reaching the lake's far shore or continued sliding into the granite wall that marked the end of available runway. Her aircraft came to rest 300 meters from the shoreline, steam rising from hot metal surfaces as they met frigid mountain air. Phoenix completed emergency shutdown procedures, while Hassan's formation circled overhead like mechanical vultures. Their pilots undoubtedly amazed that she'd successfully landed a fighter aircraft on unmarked ice in the middle of enemy territory. She activated her survival radio and transmitted on international emergency frequency. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is U.S. Navy Flight Lieutenant Zara Nakamura, call sign Phoenix. Aircraft down at coordinates. She rattled off her GPS position while checking survival gear and planning her next impossible escape. Hassan's radio crackled with his flight controller's voice, demanding immediate engagement orders. The American pilot was down but alive, her aircraft intact enough for potential intelligence recovery. Standard doctrine called for destroying the fighter to prevent technology transfer, but Hassan found himself reluctant to fire on a pilot who demonstrated flying skills that demanded professional respect. Captain Raza's voice cut through his tactical analysis. "Sir, we should destroy the aircraft before rescue forces arrive." Hassan studied the scene below. One woman standing beside her damaged fighter on a frozen lake, surrounded by mountains that would challenge any rescue attempt. She'd survived impossible terrain, executed a dead-stick landing that defied probability, and maintained professional composure throughout an engagement that should have ended in her death. Destroying her aircraft now felt less like tactical necessity than professional vandalism. Phoenix stood beside her F-16 and looked up at the circling JF-17s, their pilots undoubtedly debating her fate through encrypted communications. She'd accomplished everything possible with the resources available, threading her aircraft through terrain that no rational pilot would attempt while evading a superior enemy force. If this was where her story ended, she'd written a final chapter worthy of the Phoenix call sign. Hassan made his decision based on something deeper than tactical doctrine. The American pilot had demonstrated courage, skill, and determination that transcended national boundaries or political conflicts. She'd flown like the mountain spirits his grandmother used to describe, being so skilled they could navigate impossible terrain through pure will and supernatural ability. He keyed his radio with uncharacteristic formality. "American pilot, "This is Pakistani squadron leader Hassan. You have demonstrated exceptional flying skill. We will not engage your position pending rescue operations. Professional courtesy between aviators." The transmission was brief, clear, and completely outside standard engagement protocols. Hassan's pilots remained silent, understanding that their leader had made a decision based on principles older than any military regulation. Some things transcended the artificial boundaries that politicians drew on maps. Phoenix felt something unexpected as Hassan's words reached her through the emergency radio. Respect from a professional adversary who understood the magnitude of what she'd accomplished. Flying was a brotherhood that extended beyond national loyalties, and Hassan's acknowledgement meant more than any medal her own government might award. She keyed her survival radio. "Squadron Leader Hassan, this is Phoenix. I acknowledge your professional courtesy and reciprocate the sentiment. You fly good aircraft and maintain excellent tactical discipline. Perhaps we'll meet again under different circumstances." The exchange was monitored by intelligence services on both sides of the conflict, generating classified reports that would analyze every word for strategic significance. But for two pilots separated by politics and proximity, the communication represented something simpler: recognition between professionals who tested each other's skills in the ultimate arena. Hassan's formation departed the area as American rescue helicopters appeared on distant radar contacts. The engagement was complete, with results that no military analyst would ever adequately explain in official reports. One damaged American fighter had evaded 11 Pakistani interceptors, survived passage through impassable terrain, and executed an emergency landing that preserved both pilot and aircraft for eventual recovery. Phoenix watched the JF-17s disappear toward their home airfield, while U.S. Navy SEAHs approached her position with recovery equipment. She'd be home within hours, debriefed within days, and flying again within weeks. But the memory of Hassan's professional courtesy would remain with her forever, proof that some bonds transcended the artificial divisions that made enemies of natural allies. The rescue operation proceeded with textbook efficiency. Combat rescue specialists secured the crash site, while technical personnel assessed her F-16's condition for potential recovery. Phoenix provided tactical debrief information, while medical teams confirmed her physical condition, though no examination could quantify the psychological impact of surviving impossible circumstances through superior flying and creative problem-solving. Colonel Marcus Webb, her wing commander, arrived with the recovery team to personally assess the situation. Webb had flown combat missions over Iraq and Afghanistan, earning decorations for valor that decorated his office walls like proof of professional competence. But he'd never seen a tactical situation report that described successful navigation through the Siachen corridor, followed by emergency landing on unmarked ice. "Phoenix, I need you to walk me through this entire engagement. Start with initial contact and don't skip any details." Webb's voice carried the tone of a commander trying to understand how one pilot had accomplished what his entire wing would have considered impossible. Phoenix began her verbal debrief while watching Pakistani helicopters orbit at respectful distance, their pilots maintaining surveillance without interfering with American recovery operations. Hassan's professional courtesy extended to his entire chain of command, creating a temporary ceasefire based on mutual respect rather than political negotiation. Her account of the tributary canyon passage drew incredulous stares from rescue personnel, who'd studied topographical charts showing terrain features that prohibited aircraft operations. When she described the Siachen corridor transit, several officers exchanged glances that suggested disbelief, despite her obvious survival as proof of successful completion. Webb studied satellite imagery on his tactical tablet, comparing Phoenix's described route with terrain features that challenged helicopter operations under optimal conditions. "Phoenix, You're telling me you flew a damaged F-16 through passages that we don't recommend for rescue helicopters. Sir, I'm telling you that impossible terrain becomes possible when the alternative is certain death. The corridor passage required precise flying, but the geometry worked within acceptable risk parameters. Phoenix's response was matter of fact, delivered with the professional calm that had carried her through 15 years of challenging assignments. The technical assessment team reported that her F-16 remained structurally sound despite losing one engine and suffering battle damage that would have grounded the aircraft under normal circumstances. Recovery operations would require heavy-lift helicopters and specialized equipment, but the fighter could be transported to friendly territory for complete restoration. Webb concluded his preliminary debrief with grudging admiration for flying skills that transcended his considerable experience. Phoenix had accomplished something that would generate classified reports, tactical analysis studies, and training scenarios for years to come. But the immediate priority was extraction before weather conditions deteriorated or political circumstances changed. Pakistani military communications maintained professional courtesy throughout the recovery operation, with air traffic controllers providing advisories that ensured safe separation between recovery aircraft and local military flights. Hassan's influence extended beyond his immediate formation, creating temporary cooperation based on aviator traditions that preceded modern conflicts. Phoenix climbed aboard the rescue helicopter with her survival gear and classified materials secured for transport. The lake fell away beneath rotary wings as the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude, carrying her back to civilization, and the debriefing process that would attempt to quantify her escape through impossible terrain. During the flight to Bagram, she reflected on Hassan's decision to hold fire after her emergency landing. Professional courtesy between adversaries was rare in modern warfare, where technology often reduced human contact to electronic signatures on radar screens. Hassan had seen her as a fellow pilot rather than simply an enemy target, recognizing skills that demanded respect regardless of national allegiance. The intelligence debrief at Bagram lasted 18 hours across 3 separate sessions. Phoenix answered questions about Pakistani aircraft performance, pilot capabilities, terrain navigation techniques, and emergency procedures with clinical precision. Intelligence officers seemed particularly interested in Hassan's decision to allow her rescue, analyzing his radio transmissions for insights into Pakistani military culture and command authority. Captain Jennifer "Viper" Martinez, Phoenix's squadron mate, visited during the medical observation period mandated after extreme altitude exposure. Martinez had flown alongside Phoenix through dozens of combat missions, but she'd never seen tactical action reports that read like adventure novels rather than standard engagement summaries. Phoenix, the entire wing is talking about your canyon run. Half the pilots think you're lying, and the other half think you've lost your mind. Martinez delivered the assessment with the brutal honesty that characterized fighter-pilot culture, where exaggeration was professional heresy and survival stories required corroboration to earn credibility. Phoenix understood the skepticism. Military aviation was built on procedures, regulations, and safety margins that made impossible flying theoretically unnecessary. Pilots who survived by breaking fundamental rules were either incredibly lucky or dangerously reckless, and both categories generated suspicion among aviators trained to trust systems over individual brilliance. The preliminary investigation report concluded that Phoenix had exercised sound tactical judgment under extreme circumstances, utilizing terrain navigation techniques that weren't taught in formal training, but represented logical extensions of established principles. Her escape route analysis demonstrated preparation that transformed desperate improvisation into calculated risk management. Wing intelligence officers correlated her route selection with historical Soviet flight patterns discovered in declassified archives, confirming that the ghost flight pattern had indeed been used during Cold War operations. Phoenix's achievement was remarkable not because she'd invented new techniques, but because she'd successfully executed historical tactics under modern combat conditions. Colonel Webb approved her return to flight status pending completion of mandatory psychological evaluation and additional mountain flying training. The psychological assessment would determine whether her experience had created trauma that might affect future mission performance, while advanced training would codify her improvised techniques for potential use by other pilots facing similar circumstances. Dr. Sarah Chen, the wing's flight surgeon, conducted Phoenix's psychological evaluation with particular attention to stress responses during extreme altitude operations. Military aviation psychology had extensive data on pilot responses to combat situations, but very little information about psychological effects of surviving impossible terrain navigation under hostile pursuit. Phoenix, I need to understand your decision-making process during the canyon transit. Were you experiencing symptoms of hypoxia or spatial disorientation that might have affected your judgment? Dr. Chen's questions probed for evidence of impaired cognitive function that could indicate underlying medical issues. Phoenix described her mental state during the critical flight phases with the analytical precision that characterized her approach to all professional challenges. She'd remained fully conscious and oriented throughout the engagement, making tactical decisions based on available information rather than desperation or panic responses. The psychological evaluation concluded that Phoenix had demonstrated exceptional stress tolerance and decision-making capability under extreme circumstances. Her performance indicated superior cognitive function rather than impairment, suggesting that her tactical choices resulted from professional competence rather than medical emergencies affecting judgment. Advanced mountain flying training began 2 weeks after her medical clearance, conducted by instructors who'd studied her route analysis with mixture of professional admiration and concern about establishing precedents for future operations. Teaching impossible techniques to ordinary pilots could create dangerous overconfidence in situations where survival required exceptional skills. Chief Warrant Officer Miguel Santos had 30 years of mountain flying experience, including rescue operations in Alaska, Afghanistan, and the Himalayas. Santos approached Phoenix's training with respect for her accomplishments tempered by determination to ensure she understood the difference between successful desperation and replicable technique. Phoenix, you survived something that kills most pilots who attempt it. My job is to help you understand why you survived, so you can make better decisions about when similar techniques might work again. Santos delivered the assessment while reviewing topographical charts that showed terrain features capable of destroying aircraft flown by less skilled pilots. The training curriculum included advanced weather analysis, terrain navigation, emergency landing procedures, and psychological preparation for operations in extreme environments. Phoenix approached each lesson with professional dedication, understanding that her survival had created expectations for future performance that required constant skill development to maintain. Hassan's formation returned to Sargodha Air Base with tactical analysis reports that generated significant interest among Pakistani Air Force leadership. The American pilot's escape represented a tactical defeat that revealed potential vulnerabilities in standard intercept procedures, particularly regarding terrain masking and unconventional route selection. Air Commodore Rashid Malik reviewed Hassan's engagement report with particular attention to the American pilot's terrain navigation capabilities. Malik had commanded mountain operations for 15 years, earning recognition for tactical innovations that improved Pakistani air superiority in high-altitude environments. Squadron Leader Hassan, your report indicates the American pilot demonstrated familiarity with historical Soviet flight patterns in this region. Do we have intelligence suggesting systematic study of our terrain by American forces? Malik's question addressed strategic implications that extended beyond individual pilot capabilities. Hassan provided detailed tactical analysis while acknowledging the American pilot's exceptional skills. His professional assessment focused on lessons learned rather than excuses for tactical failure, demonstrating the analytical approach that had earned his reputation as one of Pakistan's finest pilots. The Pakistani Air Force initiated comprehensive review of intercept procedures for high-altitude operations, incorporating lessons learned from Phoenix's escape into training scenario, designed to prevent similar tactical defeats. Hassan's experience became required study material for pilots assigned to mountain patrol duties. Phoenix completed her advanced training with commendations from instructors who'd initially questioned whether her survival represented skill or luck. Her demonstrated ability to replicate complex maneuvers under controlled conditions proved that her combat performance had resulted from superior preparation rather than fortuitous circumstances. Colonel Webb assigned Phoenix to the Wing's training cadre, with responsibility for developing advanced terrain navigation curricula based on her combat experience. The assignment recognized her unique qualifications, while ensuring that hard-won tactical knowledge would benefit future aviators facing similar challenges. The classified training materials Phoenix developed included detailed analysis of terrain features that could provide concealment from radar surveillance, escape routes through mountain passes previously considered impassable, and emergency landing procedures for extreme environments. Her work contributed to tactical doctrine that would influence military aviation training for decades. International aviation publications reported her accomplishment in carefully sanitized accounts that omitted specific geographical details while highlighting innovations in high-altitude flight operations. Phoenix became a case study in military academies worldwide, representing successful adaptation of historical tactics to modern combat requirements. Hassan received promotion to wing commander with assignment to Pakistani Air Force headquarters, where his tactical analysis contributed to strategic planning for mountain warfare operations. His professional courtesy toward Phoenix was noted in official commendations, establishing precedent for appropriate conduct between adversary aircrew under exceptional circumstances. The lake where Phoenix had landed her F-16 was surveyed by joint Pakistani-American teams operating under temporary cooperation agreements negotiated at diplomatic levels. The site was designated as neutral territory for emergency landing operations, creating the first formal aviation safety agreement between the two air forces. Phoenix's call sign became legendary throughout naval aviation communities, inspiring young pilots who studied her tactical innovations while learning fundamental lessons about preparation, determination, and professional excellence under extreme pressure. The story spread through informal networks that connected aviators across service boundaries and national affiliations. Years later, Phoenix and Hassan met at an international aviation conference in Dubai, their professional paths converging in circumstances that allowed personal conversation about their mountain engagement. The meeting was cordial, marked by mutual respect that had developed through shared understanding of exceptional flying under impossible conditions. Hassan acknowledged that her terrain navigation had taught him valuable lessons about unconventional tactical thinking. Phoenix reciprocated by praising his formation's discipline and his decision to honor aviator traditions over political requirements. Their conversation was brief but meaningful, establishing personal connection between professionals who tested each other's skills in ultimate circumstances. The conference presentation Phoenix delivered on extreme terrain navigation drew standing ovations from international audiences that included military pilots, civilian aviators, and aerospace engineers fascinated by her tactical innovations. Her technical analysis provided valuable insights while maintaining security requirements that protected classified capabilities. Hassan attended her presentation, sitting in the audience while she described the engagement from her perspective. His presence added authenticity to her account, confirming details that might otherwise have seemed exaggerated. After her presentation, they shared coffee and discussed technical aspects of high-altitude flying with the comfortable familiarity of professionals who understood each other's capabilities. Phoenix continued flying combat missions throughout her naval career, accumulating decorations and commendations that recognized sustained excellence rather than single dramatic achievements. Her mountain escape remained her most famous accomplishment, but daily professionalism earned respect that transcended any individual story. She retired from active duty with 22 years of service, transitioning to civilian career as test pilot for aerospace companies, developing next-generation fighter aircraft. Her experience with extreme flight conditions made her invaluable for evaluating aircraft performance under circumstances that challenged design specifications. Hassan achieved flag rank in the Pakistani Air Force, serving as Air Marshal with responsibility for strategic planning and international cooperation. His career was marked by innovative tactical thinking and professional conduct that earned respect from adversary air forces as well as allied nations. The mountain lake where Phoenix had landed was eventually marked with memorial plaques honoring aviators from both nations, who demonstrated exceptional courage and professional skill. The site became symbolic of cooperation possibilities that transcended political boundaries when human excellence demanded recognition, regardless of nationality. Phoenix established a foundation supporting education for underprivileged children interested in aviation careers, using her military pension and civilian earnings to create opportunities for young people who might otherwise lack access to flight training. Her foundation awarded scholarships without regard to national origin, gender, or political affiliation. Hassan contributed to similar educational initiatives in Pakistan, establishing flight training programs that emphasized professional excellence and international cooperation. His programs produced pilots who understood aviation as a global profession that connected cultures through shared dedication to safety and innovation. Their paths crossed periodically at international conferences and professional gatherings, maintaining the respectful relationship that had developed from their mountain encounter. Neither spoke publicly about their engagement, but their professional interaction demonstrated possibilities for cooperation that political leaders rarely achieved. The tactical innovations Phoenix had developed during her escape influenced military aviation training worldwide, with her techniques adapted for use in various geographical environments and operational scenarios. Her legacy extended beyond individual achievement to systematic improvements in pilot preparation and survival training. Hassan's analytical approach to the engagement became standard methodology for tactical review and lesson integration, creating processes that transformed individual experiences into institutional knowledge. His contributions to professional military education earned international recognition and influenced Air Force training programs globally. Phoenix's story continued inspiring young aviators long after her retirement, with her example demonstrating that exceptional achievement resulted from preparation, determination, and willingness to attempt impossible things when circumstances demanded extraordinary performance. Her legacy lived in the pilots who studied her techniques and applied her lessons to their own challenges. The frozen lake in Kashmir remained unmarked on aviation charts, but experienced mountain pilots knew its location and significance. The site represented the intersection of human skill and natural forces, where one pilot's determination had transformed impossible terrain into temporary sanctuary through superior flying and tactical innovation. Hassan and Phoenix maintained correspondence throughout their retirement years, sharing perspectives on aviation development and international cooperation that their unique relationship made possible. Their friendship demonstrated that professional respect could bridge political divisions when based on mutual recognition of exceptional competence and shared dedication to excellence. Phoenix's final flight was a demonstration mission for aerospace students at the Naval Academy, where she showcased advanced maneuvering techniques while discussing the mental preparation required for pushing aircraft beyond normal operational limits. Her students learned that impossible was often just another word for untested. Hassan's final official duty was delivering the keynote address at the Pakistan Air Force Academy graduation ceremony, where he emphasized professional conduct and international cooperation as essential elements of modern military aviation. His career exemplified the possibility of maintaining honor and integrity while serving national interests in complex global environments. The mountain peaks where they had tested each other's skills remained unchanged by human ambition, their granite faces worn smooth by forces that predated aviation by millions of years. The mountains had witnessed their encounter with indifference, caring nothing for human achievement or failure, providing only the terrain where courage and skill could prove themselves against ultimate challenges. Their story became part of aviation folklore, told and retold by pilots who understood that flying was more than technical competence. It was about human potential tested against natural forces that respected only preparation, skill, and determination. Phoenix and Hassan had demonstrated that excellence transcended political boundaries when measured against standards that made no allowance for anything less than perfection. The legacy they created together influenced generations of aviators who learned that professional respect was earned through demonstrated competence rather than national allegiance. Their mountain encounter proved that shared dedication to excellence could create understanding between adversaries when politics failed to provide solutions to artificial divisions. Phoenix and Hassan had written their story in contrails across mountain skis, using aircraft and determination to demonstrate that human potential remained unlimited when guided by professional excellence and mutual respect. Their legacy lived in every pilot who attempted impossible things and succeeded through superior preparation, combined with courage to test untested possibilities against ultimate challenges. The sky above Kashmir continued hosting military flights from multiple nations, but no subsequent engagement matched the tactical complexity and professional courtesy that had marked their encounter. Their story remained unique in aviation history, demonstrating possibilities for human excellence that transcended the artificial boundaries that made enemies of natural allies in the eternal pursuit of flight.